Michael saw John McCabe with his thumb out and he said, "There he is," and we drove up next to John. Michael got out and grabbed him and pushed him in the back seat where I was. Michael was facing back at John trying to hit him, and John had his arms up to try to stop him from doing that. We went on the Spaghetti Bowl Bridge, then went around and tied his wrists together. Then he took another piece of rope around his ankles and attached it up to his neck. They had put tape on his mouth. John's wiggling, trying to get out. He's lying on his stomach with his legs up in the air and his head turned sideways. Then they said that this will teach you to mess with Mara anymore, and we got in the car and left. This is the story of one of the men who took part in kidnapping a teenage boy over 40 years ago. What should have been a normal high school dance in the quiet town of Tewksbury turned into a nightmare that would shock an entire community. For decades his parents fought hard for justice, refusing to let their son be forgotten, but when justice finally came, it was a bitter disappointment. One of the killers walked free, while the other faced only a charge for second-degree murder. Over 40 years of heartache, of sleepless nights and constant calls to the police, and still the family was left with an incomplete decision. Was this truly the end for a family who gave up everything to see justice done, or would they be forced to live with this crushing injustice forever? Before we dive into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cases solved after decades, don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated on more stories. Tewksbury, Massachusetts felt like a place where everyone still knew their neighbors, with its quiet streets and close community feel. It was a place that ran on trust. People often left their doors unlocked at night. Kids were out on their bikes from morning until the street lights came on, and nobody worried much about it. It was the kind of area where families settled down, built their lives, and truly believed in the safety and good nature of their town. This was the world John McCabe grew up in, a young boy full of life and promise. John Joseph McCabe was born on March 13, 1954 in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. His father Bill worked as an engineer, and his mother Evelyn was employed at the school library. He was the second of their 3 children, with an older sister named Debbie and a younger sister named Roberta. The family was very close, sharing lots of love. Everyone described John as being full of life, a bit of a prankster. Debbie often remembered a time she opened her closet to find it full of grasshoppers, a mischievous gift from her little brother. Roberta remembered his love for the outdoors. His hands were always dirty with soil, oil, grease, or leftovers from the various animals. He was always collecting like frogs. Once he even came home with a full-grown goose. By 1969, John was 15 years old. His youngest sister, Roberta, was 6 and Debbie, his older sister, was 17. The family lived in Tewksbury, also in Massachusetts. On September 26, John had a school dance scheduled at the Knights of Columbus Hall. He eagerly asked his parents for permission to go, and they, seeing his excitement, quickly agreed. He spent the entire afternoon preparing, showering, doing his hair, and even using his father's aftershave. Despite being only 15 and not yet shaving, he left for the dance that night, with the event scheduled to end at 11 p.m. He was expected home no later than midnight. By 11 p.m., his mother Evelyn began watching from the window for his return. Midnight passed, and he was still not there. Growing more and more worried, Evelyn climbed into her car, driving to the school and circling the area, calling John's name, but found no sign of him. She then drove through all the surrounding streets, shouting his name from the car window, but it didn't help. John was nowhere to be found. Desperate and aware that something was wrong, Evelyn drove to the nearest police station to report her son missing. Officers took down the information, though they could offer little assurance. 1960s policing rules often required waiting before treating a teenager's disappearance as urgent. Still, Evelyn insisted something was terribly wrong. When she returned home, a chilling feeling settled over her. She spent the rest of the night awake, praying for John's safety. The following day, September 27th, 3 young children were cutting through an empty dirt lot on Maple Street in the nearby town of Lowell, only a 30-minute drive from Tewksbury, when they made a horrible discovery. In the middle of the lot lay the body of a teenage boy no older than 15 or 16. The sight left the children terrified, and when officers arrived moments later, they were met with an equally disturbing scene. The boy had been tied up and gagged. Realizing they were looking at a teenage male, investigators immediately began checking all missing person reports filed in the surrounding towns. One report quickly got their attention. A mother named Evelyn had come in the night before to report her 15-year-old son missing after he failed to return from a school dance. The details she provided matched the boy found in the lot. With that, police identified the victim as John McCabe and prepared to notify his family after the discovery and the body's identification. Police arrived at the home of Bill and Evelyn McCabe. Due to the horrible nature of John's death, they chose not to tell the full details to Evelyn directly. Instead, they took Bill downstairs to the basement, telling him that his 15-year-old son's body had been found. Tape covered John's mouth and eyes. His ankles were tied together with rope, and his wrists had been tied separately. Another piece of rope connected his ankles to his neck. As they told this information to Bill, Evelyn, having a mother's intuition, knew immediately that the police's presence meant something was terribly wrong with her son. He was a prankster, but he would never play a prank that involved not coming home and making his parents worry to this extent. There was a vent in the bathroom that allowed her to hear everything being said in the basement. She lay on the bathroom floor, pressing her ear to the vent, and heard every single detail. She then lay there crying uncontrollably. Bill was the one who had to go and identify his son's body. The weight of that task was almost unbearable. Evelyn stayed upstairs, holding on to a thin thread of hope. But when Bill returned, the look on his face told her everything. Before he said a single word, she broke down instantly, her legs giving out beneath her. In the hours that followed, Evelyn could barely speak when officers tried gently asking her a few more questions. She kept repeating through tears, "I never should have let him go. I should have kept him home. I should have been there for him." It wasn't a confession of wrongdoing. It was the raw, instinctive guilt of a mother who had just lost her child in the most unimaginable way. She had simply wanted John to enjoy a school dance, something every 15-year-old should be able to do safely. Now she was left replaying that moment at the door over and over, wishing desperately that she had held him back, even though deep down she knew none of this was her fault. A massive investigation was launched by the Tewksbury, Lowell, and Massachusetts State Police. They carefully combed the empty lot where John's body was found, collecting the rope and tape used to tie him up and gag him, as well as his clothes and shoes. They also managed to recover a fingerprint from the area. However, it was 1969. DNA evidence was not yet a useful tool. The collected items gave no immediate leads and could not be tied to anyone. A few witnesses were found. One stated that on the night of the murder, they had seen a maroon 1965 Chevy Impala at the empty lot. Another witness reported seeing John hitchhiking on the night of the dance and being picked up by two other teenagers who attended the same school, 16-year-old Michael Ferreira and his friend, a girl named Nancy Williams. Police immediately questioned Michael and Nancy. Michael claimed he did not know John well, only having seen him around school a few times. Nancy offered a similar story, stating they did not run in the same circles. They both confirmed picking John up while he was hitchhiking and dropping him off at the dance. After dropping John off, Michael and Nancy went their separate ways. Michael met up with his 17-year-old friend Walter Shelley, and they drove to Lowell in Walter's car to buy and drink beers. Walter's car was coincidentally a 1965 maroon Chevy Impala, the same make and color a witness had reported seeing near the empty lot. The match immediately drew investigators' attention to Walter. Police searched Walter's car carefully but found no signs of John or any evidence linking Walter or Michael to the murder. Despite the lack of physical evidence, investigators brought Walter in for questioning. He went through 5 polygraph tests and was found to be lying in all important areas. However, polygraphs were considered unreliable in court, and without supporting evidence, the police had no basis for an arrest. It became another dead end the following year. In 1970, both Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley joined the Armed Forces. Police continued to investigate other possible suspects, including local drug dealers, known pedophiles, and other teenagers from John's school. But these paths produced few important leads. They also looked into a 25-year-old man named Robert Malloy, who reportedly suffered from some mental illness and knew both Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley. Malloy was named a suspect in connection with Michael, but when the lead on Michael faded, so too did the investigation into Malloy. Years passed, and the case grew cold. There was a desperate lack of evidence, few solid leads, and no real developments. It was not until 1974 that another suspect emerged, Richard Santos. He was flagged by the Tewksbury police after committing a crime eerily similar to John's murder. Santos had kidnapped a young girl on Route 38, tied her feet, tied her hands behind her back, and duct taped both her mouth and eyes. Despite the similarities, investigators could not find any direct link to John's murder, and this lead too eventually fizzled out. For 26 agonizing years, from 1974 to 2000, the case remained cold. Evelyn continued to set a place for John at the dinner table, a daily ritual that painfully reminded her of his absence. She often imagined him sitting there wondering, did he call for me? What kind of mother was I? I wasn't there for him. In a 2000 interview, Evelyn reflected on those years, saying through tears, "I don't think I've had a whole night's sleep since it happened." Bill, meanwhile, documented John's short 15 years in careful detail, creating a permanent record of both his life and his death. Writing was his way of holding on to his son's memory. He once remarked in the same interview, "I think we had every right to be proud of him. I always visualized him as being a big shot somewhere. John Joseph McCabe, my son JJ, though he never got to see those dreams come true. Recording them brought him some comfort, Evelyn, throughout all those years kept John's childhood savings a cherished reminder of him. She remembered thinking, I almost put it in the casket with him, but then I decided to hold on to it, and when I see him again, I'll give it to him." Bill and Evelyn prayed every single day for justice for their son. They never gave up hope, never stopped their efforts. Bill was relentless, constantly calling the police, trying to make sure they remembered John, and continued to investigate his case. His tireless efforts over decades with no developments kept John's memory and case alive. Finally, in November of 2000, a development occurred. It came from one of John's childhood friends, Jack Ward. Years earlier, Jack had promised Bill that he would inform him if he ever heard any information about John's murder. Jack knew many of the people John knew, making him a possible source for information. He had promised to always keep an ear out, and he did. In November 2000, Jack attended a cookout with a group of people he and John had gone to school with. Michael Ferreira was also present. As everyone sat eating, drinking, and chatting, Michael suddenly blurted out, "I know who killed John McCabe." Jack immediately confronted him. "Hold on a minute," he demanded. "You can't just say that and not say who is it?" Michael then claimed it was Walter Shelley, explaining that Shelley had killed John because he was jealous. The reason for the jealousy, Michael explained, was a girl named Mara who was 13 years old at the time of the murder. She had been dating Walter Shelley back then. Walter and Mara later married for a short period before divorcing. By the time of the cookout, apparently Mara may have had a crush on John at the time of the murder, which had made Walter furious, who was known to be a very jealous person. That is like extreme. Jack thought to himself. Jack, of course, immediately went to Bill McCabe and shared this shocking information. Bill carefully wrote down the names and called the police, telling them of Michael's confession. Despite Michael's shocking confession at the 2000 cookout, the police initially did not take the lead seriously. It took 3 years of persistent calls from Bill before, in 2003, investigators finally arrived at Michael Ferreira's home in Salem, New Hampshire, about 16 miles from Tewksbury. Michael was now working as a forklift operator and living with his wife Nancy Williams, the same girl who had been with him that night. In 1969, when they picked John up, Michael presented a very different version of the cookout conversation. He claimed that Jack Ward had had too many drinks that night and was repeatedly going around saying, "Shelley did it, Shelley did it," about John's murder. Michael told the detectives that he had simply said, "Yeah, he did," or "Yeah, he probably did," just to make Jack stop. He insisted he had never said anything about Mara or Walter being jealous. That, he maintained, was merely Jack's own theory with no supporting evidence to dispute Michael's story or confirm Jack's. The situation was reduced to a he said, she said problem. Once again, the case went cold. 4 more years passed. In 2007, a new district attorney for Middlesex County, Jerry Leone, was sworn into office. The Lowell County Police Department approached him with John's cold case, urging him to look into it. Investigators had recently reviewed all the old files again and noticed a new name had strangely appeared in Michael Ferreira's 2003 interview, a name that had never been mentioned before in any previous statements. In that interview, Michael had told the same story about the night of the murder. John was hitchhiking. He and Nancy picked him up and dropped him off at the dance, and then Nancy and he went their separate ways. He had then claimed he met up with his friend Walter Shelley to drive around Lowell and get some beers. However, this time he had suddenly thrown another name into the mix. He stated that it wasn't just Walter Shelley he was with. He had also been with a guy named Edward Allen Brown in 1969. Ed had been 17 years old and lived not far from the McCabe family. Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley had consistently been persons of interest throughout the investigation, and now by association Edward Brown was too, given he was allegedly with them on the night of the murder. Since Michael and Walter had provided no useful information thus far, investigators decided to focus on Ed, hoping to get some information from him. Edward Brown had since moved away to New Hampshire and had retired from the Air Force. In 2007, police tracked him down. They went to his house and spoke with him, but Edward claimed he knew nothing about the matter, stating he had never even heard of John McCabe. This claim struck investigators as ridiculous. John's murder had been a prominent local tragedy, widely known in Tewksbury, for someone who lived right down the road from the McCabes and ran in the same circles as kids who went to John's school. To claim complete ignorance was a huge red flag, yet if he chose to lie, there was little investigators could do. Feeling defeated, they left the interview believing he was hiding something but having no way to prove it. Shortly after they left, Edward's wife Carolyn called them. "I think my husband's lying to you," Carolyn told the investigators. About 25 years ago, He actually told me that he had been involved in the murder of a young boy. Her revelation was staggering, yet despite Carolyn's call, Edward continued to deny any involvement, and there was still no evidence to prove he was lying directly about John McCabe. Once again the case hit another dead end and went cold. The McCabe family, however, continued to fight for justice, enduring repeated glimmers of hope, only to see them extinguished. The emotional toll of these constant setbacks year after year must have been exhausting. Finally, in 2011, a new detective was assigned to the case, Detective Linda Coffin. She shared the McCabe family's unwavering desire for justice for John and committed herself entirely to the case. Her involvement rekindled hope for the McCabes and pushed the investigation forward. Detective Coffin immediately refocused on Ed Brown. Traveling to New Hampshire to interview him, she questioned him twice, then gave him a polygraph test, which he failed. Confronted with the polygraph results, Edward finally broke. He confessed, admitting he had been present when Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley killed John McCabe. Thanks to Edward Brown's confession on April 15, 2011, nearly 42 years after the murder of 15-year-old John McCabe, Edward was charged for manslaughter. Walter Shelley and Michael Ferreira were charged for first-degree murder. Bill and Evelyn McCabe were notified immediately. Bill, upon hearing the news, fell over the table and began to cry. For 42 years, he had tirelessly fought for this day. All his efforts had finally paid off. Arrests had been made in his son's murder, and justice for John seemed within reach. One officer later remarked, "Mr. McCabe held our feet to the fire. He never let us forget John McCabe's murder." It was also a chilling discovery that Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley, the very men arrested, had actually been listed in John's Book of Mourners. They had attended John's wake and his funeral. It took another 2 years for the trials to begin, with Michael and Walter tried separately. Edward Brown, however, never went to trial. He accepted a deal, no jail time, in exchange for his testimony against both Michael and Walter. With the lack of physical evidence in the case, Edward's confession made him the crucial star witness. Without him, the case likely would never have been solved. Michael Ferreira's trial began in January 2013. The prosecution team included experienced lawyers Tom O'Reilly, Elijah Willis, and James Carr. Tom O'Reilly, an older seasoned prosecutor, felt the immense weight of the case, having heard stories of Bill McCabe's unwavering perseverance over 43 years. He was committed to finally bringing justice for John. Edward Brown took the stand on January 18th, and for the first time the horrifying details of John's murder were publicly revealed. Edward claimed that on the night of the dance around 10:30 p.m. he was at home watching TV when Michael Ferreira and Walter Shelley arrived at his house. They told him they needed his help, though they didn't say what for until he got into Walter's 1965 maroon Chevy Impala with them as they drove towards the Knights of Columbus Hall, where the dance was being held. Michael and Walter revealed their plan. They wanted to find a kid who had been messing around with Walter's girlfriend Mara and teach him a lesson for doing so. At some point during their drive, Michael spotted John, thumb outstretched, trying to hitchhike there. "He is Michael," declared. They pulled up next to John. Michael, from the front passenger seat, got out, grabbed John, and shoved him into the back seat with Edward. Michael then returned to the front passenger seat. Turning to face the back, he began trying to slap and hit John, who instinctively raised his arms to shield his face. They continued driving towards the abandoned lot on Maple Road in Lowell. Upon arrival, Edward pushed John out of the car. He believed he was merely helping Michael and Walter rough this kid up, assuming they would only slap him around a little bit. Instead, Michael and Walter tripped John, getting him to the ground. Edward and Walter then held John down while Michael tied him up. Edward described the scene in his testimony. Michael tied his ankles, then went around and tied his wrists together. Then he took another piece of rope around his ankles and attached it to his neck. They had put tape on his mouth. He recalled John wiggling, trying desperately to escape, lying on his stomach with his legs in the air and his head turned sideways. "This will teach you to mess with Mara anymore," one of them said. Edward claimed that after this they all got back into the car and left John there tied up and taped. They drove around for a while drinking beers. Eventually, Edward suggested we should go back and we should let him go. They did return to the lot. Michael and Walter got out of the car, walked over to John, and stayed there for only 30 to 45 seconds before quickly getting back in. They then turned to Edward and told him that John wasn't breathing anymore. John had died of strangulation. After this horrifying revelation, they drove Edward back home. Edward could barely recall what he did after being dropped off, only remembering that he believed he went up to his bed and cried. He testified that he kept the secret for 41 years because he was scared of Michael, who had reportedly threatened to kill him if he ever told anyone. In response to Edward's entire testimony, Michael Ferreira, when interviewed by media, scoffed, "Brown's a freaking liar." He added, his tone disdainful, "He's been to Iraq and Afghanistan 5 tours. Maybe he's got something wrong in his head." Over the next 2 days Edward Brown faced cross-examination from Michael's defense. Attorney Eric Wilson, who was relentless in tearing down Brown's credibility, creating noticeable tension in the courtroom. Wilson's strategy was clear. If their star witness was unreliable, the prosecution's case against Michael for first-degree murder would crumble. Edward crumbled under the slightest pressure, admitting to lying under oath. The defense attorney Eric Wilson's voice cut through the hushed courtroom, sharp and unwavering. Mr. Brown, you've lied under oath when you're scared, right? Yes. Edward replied, his voice barely a whisper, eyes darting nervously. You've lied under oath when you're nervous, right? Yes. You've lied under oath when you're frightened, right? Correct. Wilson leaned in, his gaze piercing. And you still can't get your facts straight about that night, can you? No. Edward admitted, shoulders slumping. You were fed information that it was a dirt lot, right? Yes. You were fed information that it was near a railroad tower, right? Yes. And you're being told that Shelley was jealous over Maraschino, right? Yes. Then came the crucial line of questioning, carefully designed by Wilson to distance Michael Ferreira from the fatal act. Mr. Brown, you testified that Michael Ferreira was present. You even said he helped hold John down, perhaps tied his ankles or wrists. But can you under oath definitely tell this jury that Michael Ferreira was the one who tied the rope around John McCabe's neck, the rope that connected to his ankles, strangling him? Edward hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. I can't say for sure. Can you definitely tell this jury that Michael Ferreira applied the final piece of tape over John McCabe's mouth that caused his death by suffocation? No, I cannot. Edward mumbled, his voice a strained whisper. Wilson straightened up, turning slightly to the jury. So your testimony does not definitely place Michael Ferreira as the one who committed the fatal acts, does it, Mr. Brown? Edward remained silent, offering no further clarification. Prosecutor Tom O'Reilly, visibly frustrated, could do little to repair the damage, as Wilson had successfully created reasonable doubt regarding Michael's direct responsibility for the actual strangulation. Following that devastating cross-examination, the defense called Maraschino, Walter Shelley's former girlfriend and later wife, to the witness stand. She testified that John McCabe had never flirted with her, never hit on her, and they had never gone to the dance together. He had never shown any interest in her at all. She then dropped an even greater bombshell. At the time of the murder, she and Walter were not actually dating. She claimed they only began dating after the murder took place. However, she also stated that they started dating in September, meaning it must have been very soon after John's death on September 26th. This contradicted what she had told police in earlier interviews, where she had stated that she and Walter had been dating at the time of the murder and had been together since she was 12 years old. When confronted about these contradictions, she became evasive. I don't know, she mumbled. I can't imagine that I did say that to them. Her deflection struck many as an obvious attempt to avoid lying. Michael's defense attorney Eric Wilson seized upon this, arguing that if the core motive of jealousy for Michael was unproven, and even the relationship timeline was shaky, it further weakened the prosecution's ability to prove Michael's intent for murder. John's sister later reflected on Mara's testimony, stating, why lie about dating someone unless it was because of her that John was murdered? Many in the courtroom suspected Mara simply wished to avoid any responsibility or perceived blame, even though Walter's actions were clearly his own. Even if they had only begun dating after the murder, it was possible they had been seeing each other or in the talking stages beforehand, and Walter's jealousy over John's potential interest in Mara still could have been the motive. Mara confirmed she did go on to marry Walter Shelley, but they later divorced because she explained he was a very violent man. When asked on the stand if he was a jealous man, she responded without hesitation, absolutely. During the trial, the defense also called Detective Linda Coffin to the stand. They accused her of having tunnel vision and overlooking investigative reports that might have pointed to other suspects, specifically naming Richard Santos and Robert Malloy. Malloy had at one time been labeled a strong suspect in a police report. However, Detective Coffin clarified in her testimony, yes, he was, but in that same report Michael Ferreira was labeled the prime suspect. Bill McCabe, then 85 years old, also took the stand. It took every ounce of his remaining strength to make it to the witness box, a moment he had waited 43 years for. Good morning, Mr. McCabe. Prosecutor Tom O'Reilly began, his voice softening with empathy for the man who had fought so long. Do you remember September 27th, 1969? Yes, sir, Bill replied, his voice strained. How old was John on that day? He was 15 years, 6 months, and 2 weeks. At the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for 5 grueling hours. When the verdict was finally read, the tension in the small courtroom was suffocating. Bill McCabe, already frail from the decades-long fight, could not remain in the courtroom. The stress of the trial, the immense weight of expectation, and the visceral fear of a negative outcome were too much. He retreated to another room, convinced his heart could Notwithstand a not guilty verdict, his fears were realized. Michael Ferreira was found not guilty. As the words "not guilty" echoed through the room, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Michael Ferreira, who had maintained a facade of detached nonchalance throughout the trial, allowed a slow, chilling smirk to spread across his face. He exchanged a brief, triumphant glance with his defense attorney Eric Wilson, a subtle nod confirming his vindication. It was a moment of profound, infuriating injustice for anyone who had followed the case, a stark reminder that presence at a crime scene was not always enough for conviction if direct action leading to death could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Evelyn was left to break the devastating news to her husband. She was terrified to tell him, knowing how fragile his condition was, and how much this setback would crush his spirit. All he had wanted was justice for his son, and the entire process had been an immense strain on him for 43 years. She worried the shock would be too much. When she told him, Bill broke down 4 days later. His heart gave out. His family believed his death was a direct result of the immense stress and heartbreak from the trial. He was laid to rest beside John. Before he passed, Evelyn made a solemn promise to him. She would take over the fight and do everything in her power to get justice for their son. "I still don't believe Bill is gone," she said, her voice filled with grief. "I can still hear him snore in the night, and then I feel the bed. He's not there." Walter Shelley's trial began 7 months later on September 3, 2013. He was 61 years old at the time, remarried, and had been living just a few miles from the McCabe's. Defense attorney Stephen Naiman represented Walter. The trial, with prosecutors Tom O'Reilly, Elijah Willis, and James Carr again leading the case, presented much of the same evidence and witnesses as Michael's. However, the prosecution, learning from the previous acquittal, strategically refined its approach. Their case against Walter would hinge on a legal principle known as joint venture. Under Massachusetts law, a person can be found guilty of murder if they knowingly participate in a crime with others, even if they don't personally deliver the fatal blow. The prosecution needed to prove that Walter was not just present but was an active and willing participant who shared the intent to harm John. Their strategy was to portray Walter not merely as a participant but as the jealous and violent instigator who orchestrated the entire attack. During Edward Brown's testimony in Walter's trial, the prosecution pressed him on the sequence of events and Walter's commands. Brown's testimony remained consistent with his earlier statements regarding Michael's direct actions, but prosecutor Tom O'Reilly skillfully used it to establish Walter's greater culpability. "Mr. Brown," Tom O'Reilly began, his voice ringing with conviction, "you've stated that Michael tied John's wrists and ankles, but tell the jury who was the one who ordered John to be tied, who was the one driving this lesson." Edward hesitated, then looked towards Walter Shelley, who sat stony-faced. "Walter, it was Walter's idea," he said, "to teach him a lesson." O'Reilly pressed on, pacing before the jury, "and when the rope was used to connect John's ankles to his neck and the tape applied to his mouth, even if you cannot say whose hands performed the final twist or press, who was the instigator, who was the one whose jealousy drove this entire horrific event?" Walter Brown affirmed, his voice clearer, leaving no doubt about the hierarchy of the crime. Walter, unlike Michael, appeared more withdrawn, his face often marked with a grim, anxious expression throughout the proceedings, occasionally flinching as O'Reilly connected his words to the brutal reality of John's death. The prosecution carefully built its case, connecting Walter's confessed extreme jealousy over Mara, further supported by Mara's testimony about Walter being very violent and absolutely jealous, directly to his role in orchestrating and directing the fatal assault on John. Tom O'Reilly argued forcefully that even if Walter didn't personally tie every knot or apply every piece of tape, his clear motive and instigation of the violence made him directly responsible for John's death. Under the principles of joint venture, he presented Walter as the architect of the murder, with Michael and Edward as his unwilling or coerced participants in the initial stages. Yet after 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Walter Shelley guilty of first-degree murder. Evelyn was not in the courtroom when this verdict was read, fearing another not guilty decision. After such an identical trial, she too had chosen to leave, but it was not to be a repeat. Walter Shelley was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. In March 2016, Walter Shelley's verdict was reduced by a judge to second-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment, but because the crime occurred when he was under 18, he could be eligible for parole after a period of time. Under Massachusetts state law, the judge stated that the bulk of the evidence falls more squarely on second-degree murder. This meant Walter would be eligible for parole after serving 15 years, making him eligible in 2028. John's sisters and other family members immediately vowed to oppose any of Walter Shelley's bids for parole. A few months later, on August 12, 2016, Evelyn McCabe passed away as well. The McCabe family hoped that Evelyn and Bill were now finally at peace with their son, the senselessness of John's murder for no other reason than a jealous young man remained a profound tragedy. He was only 15 years old, a young boy excited for a school dance who had spent an entire afternoon getting ready, showering, doing his hair, and even using his father's aftershave. The night that was meant to be filled with youthful fun and excitement instead ended in horrifying, heartbreaking violence. The outcome of the trials also left a lingering frustration. Michael Ferreira, despite being implicated by Edward Brown's testimony and his undeniable presence, was found not guilty because his defense attorney Eric Wilson successfully argued that the prosecution could not definitely prove Michael carried out the direct fatal actions. Unlike Walter Shelley, who was identified as the primary instigator, Michael could not be retried, a fact that deeply troubled the family. Those who witnessed Michael Ferreira in interviews found his attitude dismissive and cocky about the entire affair, a stance that deeply angered many. While Walter Shelley's conviction brought a measure of justice, the reduction of his sentence to second-degree murder meant he would be eligible for parole in 2028, just 3 years from the present day. John's family remained firm in their vow to oppose his release, continuing their tireless fight even after the deaths of Bill and Evelyn. The long, agonizing journey for justice for John McCabe, spanning over 4 decades, was a testament to his parents' unwavering love and perseverance, a fight that ultimately cost them their own lives. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.